I'm thinking about care and caregiving and people who are taking care of us. And what about curators? Are they taking care of artists? Are curators caregivers? Are curators necessarily have to be nurturing? And this is something I wanted to start with. These are some of the topics that I would like to investigate further. This notion of care of the self, but basically it's care how you engage with the world. And it's, we're today standing in a quite artificial pose. I am holding a mic and standing and I am dressed in a kind of Greek way, alla greca, because I wanted to have a nod to this care of the self, and I think it's playfully evoking ancient masters of thought. What do you want to do? I want to do show on caring. It's just like, who cares? The question, it can be cynical, who cares? But then I said, it's a care of the self in relationship to contemporary art, but it is actually, because my arsenal is intellectual, right? This is my practice. Then I start spinning, then I started spinning ideas. What's that care for me? And I'm using, this mobilization and our response to it as a disarmament, as I did not invent it. I kind of paraphrased Peter Sloterdijk, who wrote in kind of early on in the 80s about that, mobilization, and he called it, his essay Ptolemaic mobilization and Copernican disarmament, saying that there is this kind of eternal mobilization of technical progress. And so technical progress, or consumerism, say what you want, but eternal process of mobilization here, in liberal capitalism, in market, in all these things. And then disarmament, how Copernicus disarmed the worldview, right? He managed to change radically perspective and to take away the earth from the center. So what are these possibilities of disarmament? Going back to the care of the self, because if care of the self does not exist, how possibly you can extend it, have these ripples? That's what I'm trying to say. And that care of the self can be misinterpreted as this American right-wing cult of individual, and has nothing to do with that cult of individuality. I am my fortress, I don't need anything else. On the contrary, this care has to be reconstituted, disarming these, wrestling away these ideas of selfish individual.
Yeah, or perceiving care of the self as that self in relationship with others. And you made an interesting point earlier about talking about caregivers in the society are also really devalued, and they're lower paid, and we don't recognize their work. And I think that part of the reason for that is because caregiving is so separate. We see this as a separate industry. It's not like caregiving should be part of our individual daily lives of every single person on this planet. So what I see is that institutionalization of care is that's what creates this separation, and that's what creates a lack of responsibility in everyone else, because it's someone's job and they're getting a paycheck to do that. So I don't really need to do that. But I guess what I'm trying to do with some of my projects is intervene in a way that parallels some charity services, but is separate from that, because I'm an individual, I'm an artist, and I'm bringing this project in, and I'm doing it not as a business model. So that's another kind of entrapment, a charity entrapment.
Right, but you wrote to us, when we had this kind of initial exchange, how artists are forgetting or constructed ideas of, if you do social practice, that somehow you're not going to like expect any reward other than like doing good.
Well, yeah,
so
and also
that's the fallacy.
also
right?
a lot of grants. So there's grants that you can apply for as an artist to do some work that is engaging a community, and the one stipulation of this grant is that you can't pay yourself. So it's like you can run your project, you can get materials, but if you pay for yourself, you're suddenly not the altruistic kind of artist on the pedestal that you're supposed to be. So yeah, that's a fallacy, because obviously, I mean,
and how you're going to make a sustainable living? That means that like charitable artists can only be benefactors, meaning that they're like independently wealthy.
Yeah.
So if you're independently wealthy, you are allowed to be, patron or an artist. And this is like the most problematic aspect of capitalist mobilization. So if you have capital, you're allowed to do whatever and to be. So I don't know, like how you disarm this kind of system, like in your own work. How do you work with it? And so you.
I think by distribution of power in a different way, or distribution of decision making. So I think that having like a horizontal participation in projects.
Can you just say, like, for if anybody did not hear before, like what's your latest project? Because I was amazed, how it's not about do good kind of feel good work, but it's about beauty.
Right. Yeah.
It's like beauty and goodness, So like, can you just tell us, how did you make it happen?
Well, so my last project was a mobile beauty salon, or a mobile hair salon, that visited homeless shelters and provided hair services for free. And those were given by volunteer hairstylists that were licensed stylists coming from salons, coming to volunteer their time. So in a way, this is not a service, obviously, that's supported by Department of Homeless Services. It's not federally funded. Yet it is a real overlooked need, I feel, with just being able to have the privacy and the means to present yourself the way you want to appear to society. And the project doesn't pretend to solve homelessness. It's a really simple gesture that has a different focus. So it's mostly focused on unraveling a social stigma. So it's like a truck that's built into a salon. So it's a small space that is more geared toward creating a human-to-human contact and dialogue between the participants, and just creating a space for like intimacy too. So the stylist is also a caregiver. They're there to make their clients feel cared for and touched and engaged in a conversation. And if you're homeless, you get that less than anyone because of a lot of stigmas. So that's kind of in a nutshell. Yeah.
That care of the self is really open for definition. That's why I kind of like it. We are not applying some kind of model. It really is what you as an artist need as a space of freedom. Is that like a studio practice? Is it post-studio practice? Is it like, renouncing the studio? Or is it like you are delineating your kind of place of freedom and like not kind of, making these transactions? And I wanted to talk to Kate about that, that kind of positioning of, self-representation and care, and we had like series of these discussions, and like you want to talk about like how your practice is informed by these ideas.
So I'm going to bring it back a little bit to the Foucault that you had cited in talking about it, because it's such a broad thing and an expansive thing for me that I find having points of reference like that are helpful. But as you were just talking about freedom and also renouncing something, and I thought there was an interesting moment in one of Foucault's later interviews where he talked about freedom as opposed to liberation, and that liberation, of course, is necessary for practices of freedom, but that freedom is a practice with standards and an ethical structure to it. So in my work, I am in it a lot of the time now in videos. I do these field experiments out in landscape, and I am a tool of measure myself. And it was something that I hadn't really, I hadn't been as presently obvious in my work until that time that I started doing this work. And so I started recognizing myself as a site of projection and a site from which to project. How to even, I don't know if that's really even relating to what we're talking about, except it so explicitly does for me. One of the things that Jody was talking about, I think, too, is this institutionalization of care. And something Foucault talks about is institutionalization of care that would normally be something you would do for yourself, like medical or psychological or, dental, what have you. And to have this more holistic approach and this breaking down of categories is something that I'm really interested in. Because when I feel like when you take those things on for yourself and you get to a point of knowing yourself, is when you can see and begin to know others as well and resonate outwards.
Start this conversation, and it does make sense because it's like perpetuated in your practices. Like this is like how you approach things, and it's not about making a work and that is kind of end result. The work is just kind of aspect of that being in the world or practice.
I really appreciate that you said that, because it does feel like a rolling along rhythm. And Frank and Tracy and I were talking about this a little earlier, in that these rhythms have manifestations at certain times, which is to say, my work is particularly interested in this resonance amongst things in a landscape, this intersubjective perceptual reciprocity. But that's not to distinguish the individual entities in that landscape. And so as one entity within a landscape of many, and that landscape being a fluid one, how are we all manifesting on each other, and how do you vibrate within yourself? And again, in Foucault's later interviews, one of the things he says is the care of the self really begins with the knowledge of the self as a point of freedom and practice. So the more I've gone into my own subjective self and embodied that in my work, the more expansive I feel I've been able to be. So, for example, by interviewing women that had grown up on the same land that I had for generations, and just thinking about how do they sound having run through the same woods that I ran through. How do I sound in relation to that? How do they have a conversation with each other? How might they have had a conversation with the land? Conversation being a category that we might say is wrapped around talking, but there are different ways to have conversations, And I don't know, by pinpointing certain ideas that I have about how I may have been structurally formed by a landscape or an environment, and how they may have been structurally formed by a landscape and an environment, and how we then form a harmonic, I think it's interesting because each note in a harmonic is its own self, a vibration, you know.
Can you talk more about like how you know, like knowing yourself? Like, because this is something that you're talking about is a private, solitary action, or is it like knowing yourself through your relationship with others, or in the world, or your relationship with the earth, like you're talking about?
That's a good question. I guess that's the crux of the question, right? That's the pebble dropped in the center of the
To make the
circle
ripple.
rippling outwards, I suppose. But like also acknowledging other ripples too, from pebbles being dropped. But I do think for me, just very straightforwardly, the more I've gone into very specific things and very specific ideas to myself, the more, for example, I'm going to walk up and down this hillside over and over at different rates of speed, videotape it. It's me, it's the hill that I ran up and down a lot as a kid. It's the same one. It happens to be the same one that these women were running up and down, as however many other people, however many other deer and squirrel and whatever, leaves falling down. But I am the thing that I have control over, I guess, and I am the thing that I can speak to from inside of it. So how might kind of trying to get some data on that then relate to other things? Does that make sense?
I want to switch the theme now to this kind of close collaborations. What if you have you drop two pebbles at the same time, and you make these concentric ripples that are kind of how would you say this, like a Venn diagrams, when they're they're not you're not like one being, but you're self-expanding in a couple, in a artist collaborative, as a kind of, how do you call this yourself, like artist couple, like pair, like a duo, I don't know, like triple manzanita.
Yeah, I mean, we are, or we have become
or
one.
A permanent working organization, permanent working unit. I don't know.
No, I mean unit. I mean, I think that's just it. I mean, we're a permanent unit. We've been making work together now for almost a decade, and married for almost a decade, and we realized that we, in terms of just keeping the conversation about caring.
Hey, you're here not to kind of say, oh, it worked for us, but really to show us how negotiation of this care of the self works when you're when you're making things together and kind of approaching the world as as a united front. How does that work? How do you fortify? How you empower? That's what we're how you know yourself within the couple, and I know by knowing you and your work that's functioning. So you're here to tell us how it's how is it when it's when it's successful, these disarming processes.
There are so many interesting things that we could speak about within this dialogue that can probably go on for hours, but what I found most interesting was earlier in the conversation when you started was ethics being a constant. And to me, it is, and self-care is a constant. It's like an involuntary motion. It's like the beating of the heart. And there's levels of self-care, right? There's luxurious levels of self-care, and there's just primal levels of self-care. And it runs the gamut of all types of socioeconomics and demographics. But I think something that is inherent with a lot of people, maybe it's a humanistic thing or an animalistic thing, is after you've reached the comfort and that involuntary level of self-care, you have this burning desire to have that same passion and share it with another person, or to see what happens when you bring another person or another human being into your life, and how that changes that self-care and how that changes the beating of the heart. And it's not like, I'm not trying to make it like a super cheesy thing, but it's negotiation, it's tension, it's two human beings who are completely different, no matter how similar they are, and that friction, and what happens when that friction is right? What happens when those two pebbles drop and our ripples are sort of in sync with one another? And
then also just, again, caring for us also equals sort of sharing, and like sharing in a way that, like, as artistic practice, as a marriage, I mean, like, again, like, it's all one, and then the work is a byproduct of those things, which is, if we go back to the Venn diagram, the middle is the byproduct, which, that then equals sort of like all these breakdowns of negotiations, this sort of like deconstruction of, I think, all the things that sort of make or break sort of like how humans then disperse sharing. We think about Foucault. I think also for us, Foucault has been huge, in his essay of heterotopia, like, at least for me, like, the biggest sort of thing I got from that essay was about space.
It's crucial to all of our practices, whether it's an internal dialogue or a dialogue with your friends. And for us, that dialogue never ceases. It's always ongoing, which is one of the reasons why we continue to collaborate.
Yeah, and like, to go back to sort of sublet, we lived in and around in people's places via sort of Airbnb, friends of friends. So we photograph these objects, and again, like, these objects then hold the value of care for these homeowners. So again, like, caring is sort of like a very huge thread in the way we live and the way we share our work. Because then, like, how the only way that people can relate to these sort of photographs or, I guess, objects that we make is that then they have to remember their own lives. And then they have to go back into their own history banks and figure out, does it then relate to their lives or not?
Your work is like about this like connected effort of life that brings it brings the work to the surface, but it's like how you lived that project together. And then Julie's work from me was at least the ones that I saw so far was about this like kind of delegated performances, like in video, like delegated, like she delegates people to work for her. So, how do you situate now, within this notion of care of the self when you work with others? And it's like, is it like for yourself or for others is completely moot point, but we do, we do engage others. So like, if you can say something about that, like when you work with, and like, it's not necessarily that you had different like works that are not necessarily participatory, but I would like to hear about that.
But you say I delegate. It's maybe not. It's precise and not precise in the same time.
Yeah, but you say
like to. It's interesting to jump into the conversation this way because, like, to me, the studio is a platform where, like, the studio can exist if there is a true everyday care of myself, because I'm the one who entered the studio, so that's the first step, right? And then, so there is this, and from there I can, like, I dare now to say, like, that I can trigger a vision. So how it works, it's like I have an image that I want to reach because it makes sense in the world, and it's coming here, very much like a painter, or like it's like comes like a conviction that it has to do. And after, I will start to think often about someone, some specific interpreter, which is to me an individual, someone that gravitates around my mind. And often I will start to make a sculpture to connect with the material world.
The ethical constitution of the self, or kind of it's like a performative notion of freedom that has to be performed as a practice on every, what did you say, like heartbeat or like waking moment, or this is why I like the idea of in a mobilized world what we can offer. And this is not only, feminist, but it's all feminine, is that like a nurturing approach and disarmament. So I am not saying we go with the flow, right? Like we are like accepting of everything. No, we are radically, ready to transgress, question, rebel, or criticize. Positive politics in itself carries that, the readiness for change and willingness to, to constantly, question everything and to act upon it. But, I saw it and thank God, it makes me feel better and makes me hopeful that this disarmament, call it however you want in your practice, is like it's a possibility, like you're disarming all the violence that is coming our way as something that is given as an entitlement, as you mentioned the background, being an outsider, being well, it's hard for us to say we are outsiders because we are here sitting comfortably. We are not the dispossessed and disenfranchised. Let's not be cynical, but to a certain degree, not feeling that and like that we are entitled. And we don't feel frustrated about it. That's also something that's important for me, because I don't have the place of power. I will, jump at that power because I want to grasp it. On the contrary, I'm saying, by disarming these impossibilities, I find places of action, and my action is just being able to hear you. That's what I had to say, basically. We are not interested in criticizing usual circumstances, your usual ways of doing business, status quo perpetuation, or however you call it. We wanted to propose a way that is caring. My idea of late capitalist mobilization is not something that, that they're like a beast to be tamed. I saw that as a possibility of proposing disarmament. And disarmament is, yes, it's related to liberation, but it comes, separately. Disarmament is a radical, active participation in the art world, in these testimonies by artists, that they are negotiating obstacles in different ways, but what they share in common is that willingness to disarm impossibilities or unsustainable models of behaviors and action. So I'm empowered myself when I see that, how they make things happen, how they negotiate and their own practices. And this is for me, caring, giving care, taking care, and also receiving so much back from that involvement. So this is a lesson for me, and I'm grateful that we shared it together here on caring.